Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 9th, 1964, a three-day riot erupts in Panama's Canal Zone as locals protest the U.S. presence in Panama. 28 people died and $20 million worth of property was destroyed. As we'll get into, it all started with a dispute over a flag, but of course this was about so much more. In the wake of these riots, Panama broke off relations with the U.S. and appealed to the Organization of American States and the United Nations, and in many ways this started the long, slow process of the Panama Canal region returning to Panamanian control, which happened finally in 1999. Of course, now there's talk from the incoming President Trump that he wants the canal returned to U.S. control. We'll see where that goes, but maybe the resentments that led to the riots in 1964 are still there as President Trump tries to wind American imperialism back up. But here to discuss the 1964 Panama Canal riots are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I think we've done a couple Panama Canal episodes, but not too many. And so this is a chance to do a little bit of background as well as what goes into these actual riots in 1964. But the early part of the 20th century, right, when the question over the canal and its construction and its control really kicks into gear, right, Niki?
Yes, so it's in 1903 as Panama is emerging as an independent nation. The U.S., as listeners may recall, in the late 19th and early 20th, and basically every century, are quite meddlesome in Latin, Central, South America. And this was also the case with Panama. And in Panama, we're particularly active because of the idea of constructing the Panama Canal, which was done under Teddy Roosevelt. The U.S. claims a certain portion of Panama. They get it in the treaty that they signed with Panama, the Hayes Treaty in 1903, in order to have control over this canal that is cut into the isthmus and connects the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean. And then becomes just like an incredible trade route, right? Because it means you don't have to go around South America. And that is one expression of American imperialism at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, and it's a big swath of land. I mean, it's sizable. It's 50 miles wide and about, or I should say 50 miles long and then about 10 miles wide. But these are big chunks that have been pretty much ordained like U.S. territory in that zone.
Yeah, so, eventually there would be U.S. control over the police, the schools, the ports, the post offices, effectively a U.S. territory. The original treaty, notoriously, but it is signed, quote, in perpetuity, which I know that was like the way that the U.S. signed treaties and a lot of places signed treaties. I got to say, I even by 1903, part of me was like, didn't people not know we shouldn't be signing these in perpetuity treaties anymore? It's kind of amazing that just not that long ago, these kinds of treaties were still going. And of course, that plants the seeds for all sorts of questions of control and resentment and, economic extraction and so forth. It's kind of a slow build that comes to a head by the, middle of the 20th century, that by that point, Panamanians are really thinking, okay, we got a real raw deal here, right?
Yeah, because, the U.S. is sending annual payments, I think, of $250,000 to Panama, but that's nowhere near what both the land and the control of the canal is worth. And what ends up happening, because the U.S. has sort of claimed control over that stretch of land that Kellie described, you have people who are living on that land, many of them white Americans, who have sort of set up for themselves a little slice of what they see as paradise in the middle of Panama, where they have special privileges, where they are much wealthier than the people around them. And that creates, as you can imagine, just like really intense tensions between the Panamanians and the people in the Canal Zone who call themselves Zonians.
Yeah.
Zonians, in a very Zeusian kind of...
That little slice of paradise feels a lot like, 1940s South, right? America, right? There's a real sort of racial and class dynamic here.
Yes. Yeah. And all of the attitudes, all of the racial attitudes that go along with that. The idea of this colonial mindset is how the Americans are treating Panamanians in that space, looking down on them, being obnoxious, being rude and offensive, looking at them as second-class citizens in their own country.
Yeah.
Right, which is colonialism, right? And in fact, I mean, just to put a even finer point on it, one of the people who grew up in the Canal Zone described it as, it was like if you take a slice of Ohio and transplanted it to Panama. And interesting depiction of paradise, Ohio, but also B, like, you're doing the colonialism thing. You're doing the imperialism thing where you're like setting up Ohio in the middle of Panama with, as Kellie was describing, all of the racism that goes with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's usually white U.S. citizens who have the most rights and the most privilege and the most access to services, and it's a lot of black Panamanians and migrant laborers who are building the canal and working the schools for much lower pay. I mean, you have colonialism, a sort of replication of the Jim Crow United States going on here. All of that is sort of wrapped into this. So let's advance this to the moment we're marking here, 1964. There are these 3-day riots. What is our sense of what precipitates them, and then why is this kind of the moment that seems to push through?
So part of the resentment actually comes from the flag and the Panamanian flag and how it is always hung next to the United States or the American flag. And this one particular school, Balboa High School, basically decides it's not going to hang the Panamanian flag. And that draws a lot of resentment because people don't want to see this as a space that is solely the United States. The flag is a reminder that they are in Panama and that they are Panamanians too. And so a group of high school students just across the zone decide they're going to protest and they're going to take this Panamanian flag and they're going to march to the gates of the school and demand that they put up the Panamanian flag. And it's kind of interesting because there's a counter protest that takes place in front of them where Americans are standing in front of the flagpole and they start to sing the Star Spangled Banner. And it's actually not quite clear on how the altercation starts, but there is a violent physical altercation. People are killed, rocks are thrown, the police has to be brought in, and it takes days in order for this rebellion to occur. People start to loot. And it really is marked by this moment of the flag and really sovereignty.
I'm always so interested in those fights over the flag because, of course, it's pure symbolism in a way.
Yeah,
people are fighting over the symbols of who has power in this space. And because there had been, the U.S. was trying to soften its image in the world by the 1960s. When John Kennedy was president, he starts programs like the Peace Corps in order to be like, hey, we're not just military monsters coming and throwing our power around in all of these different countries, but we're actually here to be good citizens and to support democracy. And he's actually the person who negotiates this idea that actually in the Canal Zone, it shouldn't just be U.S. flags. It should be Panamanian and U.S. flags. And of course, the people who are living in the Canal Zone are not as excited about that. Mm-hmm. But I also think that, it is also a precursor to the student protests that we're going to be seeing in the United States at this time, and in the U.S. South, and then on college campuses opposing the Vietnam War. But it's the same kind of activism. It's students who see something that they see as a wrong and trying to find a way to make their political arguments. And in this case, as also happens in the United States, students get killed doing that.
Yeah. Well, and moreover, there's an element here of there had been a federal order from JFK administration that the flags should be flown together. And so this high school was in defiance of that. And I think that's, it evokes a lot of the sort of what happened in the South when, local schools or local governments would just defy federal orders, and that often was the precipitating event. Can I just say a word about, when we're talking about sort of irony and symbolism, the school that's under U.S. control in the Canal Zone that refuses to fly the flag is, as you mentioned, Balboa High School. Balboa, Spanish conquistador. So we have a U.S. school named in Panama, named after a Spanish conquistador. I mean, I grew up in Costa Rica, as I think listeners know, right next to Panama. And, half the stuff there is named after conquistadors, and I don't think there was a ton of deep questioning about that. But it is an interesting element here that the U.S. is this all takes place in a sort of U.S. school named after a colonial project. So
it's still baffling to me that you can live in another country and not want to be reminded that you are in another country. I mean, like, it's the Americans almost see the Panamanian flag as an affront to their own existence there, and it's wild.
Folks, I have very good news to deliver right at the top of the new year. That's right, it is 2025, and the great Alex Goldman is back with a new podcast called Hyperfixed, right here on Radiotopia. Isn't it nice to get good news to start a new year? You know Alex, right? You know Alex. I've actually known Alex for a long time, going all the way back to when we were at WNYC together. He worked on the media, I worked in the newsroom. He went on to make the legendary and much beloved podcast Reply All, and now all is right with the universe because Alex is back with a new show on Radiotopia. Some things just make sense. So, what is Hyperfixed? Well, it's a show in which Alex and his team try to solve problems for their listeners. No problem too big, no problem too small. What's that mysterious button do? Why do the big coolers at grocery stores not have doors on them? Should I have kids or not? Along the way to answering these questions, Alex takes you on a journey to uncover the hidden systems and rabbit holes that help explain how we got here. And if you know Alex's work, you can rest assured that there is some vintage Goldman grumpiness along the way. Seriously, when we say that Radiotopia is the home for the most original audio makers in the world to try their ambitious new projects, this is what we are talking about. So, help welcome Alex Goldman to Radiotopia. Rejoice in an excellent new show to add to your rotation. It's called Hyperfixed. Hyperfixed. Check it out right now, wherever you get your podcasts. At the time, a lot of Panamanians saw like the Berlin Wall and sort of drew parallels there. I mean, I think this was sort of this connects to other struggles in the U.S. as we've been discussing, but also around the world. The riots go on for a few days. There's crackdown. There's rocks. There's police responding by opening fire, tear gas. What is the sort of aftermath? And then I think we can open the aperture and talk about the political ramifications of this.
So the aftermath is there's still some murkiness around, how many people were killed, who killed whom. There's finally sort of a ratcheting down of the violence. In international perspective, because again, this is during the Cold War years, the U.S. does not have a lot of friends backing up its actions in the Canal Zone. Britain and France, two major U.S. allies in this period, are both just like, this isn't great. This is not how you should be acting in your colonies, which, given their record and how they've acted in their colonies.
I know.
But they had also, these countries by the 50s and 60s were seeing their empires dismantled. And I think there probably was a part of that was like, hey, you've been sort of encouraging us to give up our colonies. Like maybe you need to be doing it yourself. Seemed to be a part of this.
Yeah. It does take a while for the kind of treaties to then be drafted that would eventually give control back to Panama, which again didn't happen until the 1990s. But throughout the 60s, Panama, like a lot of Latin America, like a lot of places in the global South, are kind of shifting leftward, and so there's a number of treaties that are proposed in the wake of this riot that then the sort of ascendant communist forces in Panama reject for not being radical enough. And then there's a military junta in the 70s in Panama that sort of puts all of this into. So it's a sort of slow process up until kind of the mid-70s to then finally arrive at a treaty that would then say, okay, by 1999, control is going to go back to the Panamanians. Here comes
good old Jimmy Carter.
Here comes Jimmy Carter again. We haven't done this, and maybe it's worth its own proper episode, but it is Carter who negotiates this Torrijos-Carter treaty that dissolves the Canal Zone and then sets a timetable for closing bases and transferring full control back to Panama by the end of 1999. Carter gets a lot of flack for this. There's another little missing kind of storyline from Carter's years, but it is a pretty salient issue for him. People from the right are sort of saying, well, Jimmy gave away the canal to a bunch of communists.
Yeah, it's something that we maybe could also do an episode on because there's a real split in the right about what should happen here. I think it's William F. Buckley ends up debating Reagan over what should happen with the Panama Canal, because Reagan says, no, we definitely need to retain control of that. It is important for our geopolitical strength, and also it's ours. And we talked a little bit about in our special episode at the end of the year about Reagan sort of coming in as this strongman and positioning Carter as somebody weak on the world stage. And he would point to something like this, like, oh, look, Jimmy Carter's out there dismantling America's empire and apologizing around the world for all of these things that the United States has done. And so this becomes emblematic in this way, even though the Torrijos-Carter treaties actually peacefully resolve a situation that could have gotten much more violent.
Yeah, and it had been Nixon's administration that started the talks. For what it's worth, you're right. There's a split among the right. I read a piece that kind of made a somewhat convincing argument that Panama was like the turning point for Reagan in that primary heading into 1980. That like he was languishing a little bit, and then I think it's like in North Carolina, he starts talking about this on the stump, and he starts doing these debates, and people seem really fired up by this kind of like, America first type rhetoric around the canal. And then he wins a couple primaries, and he gets some pep in his step. So maybe the Panama Canal negotiations were responsible for the Reagan era. Who knows?
It's wild. It does sort of perpetuate Carter's legacy, though, as someone who's always trying to, again, think about human rights and things like colonization and make sure that this is sort of the last remnant of that colonial control that the United States had.
And actually, this makes me think of something that I've been seeing a little bit since Carter died. And we got a couple emails about this, too, when we did our Carter episode. Carter's foreign policy legacy is largely one of trying to stabilize. But, it is a little spotty. He played nice with some unsavory regimes and, sent some funding to some places that we probably shouldn't be too proud of. So I think there's some legit critique there. But I take the overall point about this deal that he negotiated here being kind of in line with his approach to foreign policy. Let's turn to the current incoming Republican president, who has, among the many things posting on Truth Social, brought this question of the Panama Canal back into the conversation, or at least our little conversation here. But Trump tweeted, socialed, truthed, whatever it is, a couple weeks ago. He said, quote, "The Panama Canal should be returned to the United States of America in full, quickly, and without question if the U.S. isn't given better treatment there." What is Trump up to?
Niki. Two things, right? Like, one of them is that he sees this as a negotiation tactic, right? The end of that post indicates that, oh, well, I will take the canal back if you don't give us preferential treatment. Fine, whatever. But I also think there's a bit of Putin-esque imperialism, right? Like, we're going to start clawing back what was once rightfully ours. And that kind of thinking, especially from somebody who admires strong men who make territorial incursions. It's Russia and Ukraine, it's China and Taiwan. It's this sense that this is what powerful men do. And so Trump is going to do it. And I think that once you fold in Canada and Greenland and all of the other places that he's rattling sabers at, I think that double explanation covers, I think, just about everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple things come to mind. I mean, one is I think anytime Trump just mouths off like this, it's incumbent upon the press to point out he can't just do this. He can't just Trump could say anything he wants about annexing Greenland. It's not it's worth sort of taking those aspirations and inferring something about what he is up to. But I don't think I've seen some headlines.
It would be illegal.
I've seen some headlines that Trump plans to annex Greenland. It's we'd have to break a ton of laws in order to do that, which he may want to. But the other thing is, we talked about this on our last episode or on our recent episode about kind of heading into this year. What are the eras of America that are kind of feel resonant to right now? And there's been a few other things just in the last few days from the Trump camp that really seem whenever I've thought about Make America Great Again, I've thought loosely, I've been post-war America, that was, when America was booming and still had its sort of imperial might or whatever. I think I'm feeling like Make America Great Again is like 1912, like
1890, baby.
Yeah, maybe 1890, but like right around here, right? Like we were tariffing the hell out of everyone. We were sort of cutting deals to control the Panama Canal. We had robber barons who were making all the money in the world. Like, I think the mask is off a little bit on that, just in some of the kind of way they're talking about the economy and American might. Yeah. But I got to say, like
post-war America, it's like Gilded America, right?
Exactly.
Gilded Age.
Yeah. It's post-Civil War America.
Really.
But I just kind of was, to be honest, like just walking around a little bit with an idea that like I thought there was a general consensus that like post-war America was kind of the thing we all want to get back to. And it's like, no, maybe not.
I mean, remember, that's the New Deal era.
Yeah, right,
and
exactly.
Even though it has this like halcyon vision, I think, in that kind of like, we want to go back to the Leave It to Beaver times. Actually, I do think that this turn of the 20th century parallel is really important, because when you fold in the courts too, we should do some Lochner era stuff with the courts and how they're used to strip people's rights away in the way that the current court is doing. I think you get something much more parallel, because in the post-war era, it's the Warren Court, and they're like protecting rights left and right.
Sure, yeah.
And so I think, even though that, I think the 1950s is our sort of like pivot point when we think about the toxic nostalgia, I think we're in much deeper trouble than that.
We got to go back way earlier, and to even more troublesome times, believe it or not.
All right, well, we will leave it there on that sunny note. I have a feeling we're going to
expect more endnotes like that.
We're going to be hitting singing that tune a fair amount over the course of this year. But there it is. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
The wind of change is blowing half a gale in the Panama Canal Zone. Americans had to defend themselves as students and other rioters demanded an end of the 61-year-old Canal Zone Treaty with the United States. Panamanians had scant respect for American property. At this stage, the best hopes were that the trouble would end as quickly as it flared up.
Radiotopia. From